Hello everyone, today we talk about the formation of medieval monarchies, more specifically the Western European ones from the 11th to the 13th centuries. This sounds a very old type of Schwerpunkt video that, especially in the channel's early days, was a very frequent theme. For manualistic purposes, meaning that even though it's funny to chase a very specific topic into, in fact, a magnificent rabbit hole, as we're doing now, for example, with biographies and other, strategic inquiries, it's relevant to talk about the general picture, the background, but also the fundamentals of major political, institutional, social aspects that inform, especially the military side of the story, as far as our more frequent focus is concerned. You know that I've engaged often in video commentaries about some of the most watched videos by, kings and generals, like, let's debunk this myth about the Middle Ages, then eventually actually create more myth in the process than they actually dispel. In fact, there is a very peculiarly curious dynamic whereby, in order to dispel other people's myths, you have to start with, in fact, historiographical conceptions that never really existed, so to act as if you had this higher, deeper understanding of the subject. I'm throwing strails, quite offensively. Again, I'm a small channel, I can do whatever I want without too many consequences. This is not a problem. I would do that even if the channel was much longer reaching. But this is important because at the end of the day, I've seen, also as those very videos confirm from both sides, that people often approach YouTube history content with this sort of, it's like when you Google about the Middle Ages, the first voice that emerges is Middle Ages facts, right? I will not even begin to attempt explaining what we mean by historical fact in general, but it's very sociologically and psychologically interesting to realize that not just, of course, we live in a world of people who think that there is some, truth sculpted in the firmament that they can personally acquire without, a superhuman effort, as a matter of fact, because truth does exist. It's just too often out of reach our poor cognitive needs, but that you can somehow get this flash information. And about what, facts about the Middle Ages, what do you care about? Like, what do you really want to know, right? When it gets to, say, some more serious, say, historical ambition, maybe of someone who's starting university, studying history, etc., and, they want to hear something from someone who's a bit more ahead and generally wanting to deepen a bit more the picture. Of course, starting from some fundamentals is crucial, and passing through especially polities, states, if you want to call them this way, society, is a pretty good beginning for a number of reasons. First of all, at that time and this may be really the most important reason. At that time in your studies, you're essentially an iconoclast. You don't really believe that there is a great refinement. You don't understand that there is a level of sort of intuition that the more you go ahead as an actual expert, and the more becomes the sap of everything that you do, as a matter of fact. You want, in fact, facts in this sense, something you can fall back on. In the moment in which you're building this great construction should be your historical knowledge. And talking about polities and society is, in a sense, more reassuring. At least there are some aspects of it that seem to be more, say, immobile, and or at least only gradually changing. And that if you get if you grasp the fundamentals of, can be quite useful for the rest of the interpretation. This is kind of obvious. It is something that eventually you even get past because you start getting interested in the more dynamic aspects of the world, or the more interesting, without forgetting about the fundamentals. I, as I was saying before at the beginning, made already many videos about this topic, so I'm not sure how original it's going to sound, provided that most people haven't necessarily followed me for a long time, nor they know, in fact, the extent of my work. YouTube, unfortunately, does not really help digging that out. Sometimes, too often, at least, I have people asking me, could you please make a video about that? And, I've already done it, and they haven't searched, essentially, for even maybe tens of videos on that topic. And so it's a bit frustrating to an extent. But it's also really healthy to repeat some of this and to expand further this vision on the subject matter from the top, let's say, of what we acquired along the years. Meaning, if I had explained this to you 5 years ago, I would have really used very different frames. I would have really phrased this in very different ways. Would have put the accent, the emphasized focus on very different aspects of the same. Probably the most interesting video you can watch relatively to this is the one about the overwhelming expansion of Western Christendom in the 13th century, that adds a bit more of sort of zeitgeist and that can be well blended with this more, again, political, statal, institutional inquiry that we'll look at today. So between the 11th and the 13th centuries, the rise of expansive, territorially and institutionally defined political entities unfolded as a process with some few consistent characteristics, whether in its timeline, modes of development, or resulting outcomes. Already this idea can be profitably corrected, because it's not like monarchies were born at this point. Right? These monarchies at large already existed from centuries. There is a tendency of historiography to present you the rise of what will essentially be national monarchies, also in the more distant future, start compacting under the profile of a feudal statehood that will, manifest in absolute terms with a grander, sort of more absolute power concentration, right? The means being fairly similar to the ones that already existed. Very often this broader historiographical inquiries that they have to explain you in a few words how, again, the Middle Ages developed, etc. They're always informed by some sort of modernistic bias, because at large, the manuals that still at least focus in this relatively impersonal history of these monarchies abstractly meant, of course, have to be praised, because they try to essentially identify the common elements that by which we can usefully conceive this statal development, this monarchic augmentation. But that, however, seemed to derive from, in fact, a structuralistic and modernistic perspective that was fixated especially on the idea of statehood in quite strictly and almost centralistic institutional standards. We've seen this in our history of historiography videos, that at some point, especially in the contemporary era, in the last couple of centuries, when mediavistics started becoming something more uniformly serious across the civilized world, a great emphasis was placed on the nation state, right? On the fact that, of course, like incredibly more centralistically power systems like our recent ones would have traced essentially their foundation in this, more or less in this time in history, for different reasons that can stem from both from a nationalistic or socialistic interest, or a blend of the two, as I always say, right? When we start talking of nationalism instead of nation, or socialism instead of society, we're essentially smelling a big deal of post-traditional world that self-referentiates to essentially the state as a substitution of imperial power, of God, of metaphysics, and that therefore just looks at this relatively bureaucratic, administrative, tax-based, and impersonal system that we understand with all the due approximation as a state. Again, everything happens by degrees in history. You can profitably spot this in also feudal monarchies, and we are talking states. I mean, personally, I don't refrain from using this term, even to just if it were for the fact of needing to conventionally address the topic. And the word state is incredibly complicated to philosophically, historiographically, sociologically, politicologically explain, right? But somehow everybody understands what that is basically about, right? So if we revolve around, and this was a term, it was mostly, as you know, used from the 16th century onward, right? And it mostly referred, this is a Machiavellian term from the French usage. Power concentration. We'll skip also any other millenary perspective, how this would happen or whatever. We're again sticking to the conventional here. In the society of the 11th century, exercising control over any territorial expense necessitated, of course, ownership of substantial seigneurial estates. There is a bit of an even today, when you think about today's states, people objectively agree on the sense of a state of law, of some broader, again, bureaucratic, administrative system, citizenship, direct participation to politics, to civic rights, voting, etc. When you actually look at it, however, it's just a sum of interactions. So when you look at seigneurial power, so lordships, etc., you realize that the participation to power at the time wasn't simply, again, a guy at the head of everyone and the others just plowing the land without any kind of say in those matters, right? Especially, there is this bit of bias for the Middle Ages, as if, peasants were freer in, the modern age than in the Middle Ages. This is absolutely false and wrong. That's not how it happened, right? That happened after the crisis of the later Middle Ages. And by the 11th century, say, peasants who still worked the land largely to pay essentially hash money for the local lord to protect them, whatever, were doing so in a quite tendentially consensual fashion. There were also quite violent communities capable of also killing lords and mostly also beating the hell out of each other, mostly following, however, the lords against other lords and other peasants, as de facto vertical divisions that's much more important than the horizontal ones in identity and social, cultural terms and so on, and that's also interesting to look at. The point is that the Western European standard of state emerging in these centuries is based on feudalism, right? And as you know, the last commentary made on Kings and Generals I was recalling before was exactly about the notion that feudalism basically did not exist, that it was at least something relatively marginal. It wasn't, but they didn't even know what they wanted to tell about that. And they were essentially trying to create this, obviously, scarecrow, like kind of straw man argument, that as if anyone in medievalistics had ever believed that there was a centralized feudal state where every single vassalic relation and beneficium derived from a straight line with the king along the various echelons. Of course, this is not the case, but nobody ever really thought about that either, right? The reason I'm saying this is that if you look at the rest of Europe and the world, you realize that Western feudalism was not unique, at least in the sense that feudalism was not unique. Clientary relations, private contracts, oligarchy, there are many levels that intersect at the same time. And say post-World War II historiography, especially structuralism, again with all the Marxist bias, was basically, while starting from a Western perspective, trying to single out the West in almost negative terms, as if feudalism in this privatistic form was some kind of imperfect state that was mostly imperfect in perspective of more contemporary states rather than other countries, but leaving also this strange aftertaste as if, I don't know, the Arabs or the Byzantines or whatever had not much more centralized systems, which they had per se, but the fact that these would have been more functional systems and that by some degree they were not privatistic or cliental or even vassalitic, which are all adjectives that can be profitably used in certain circumstances. I mean, if you look at the pronoia system among Byzantines and the condition of peasants by the 11th century, how power was it was de facto, regardless of the more unitarily statal profile of the Byzantine civilization, in parts that are fundamentally a privatistic oligarchic system in many ways, even a feudal one, if you really, again, define feudal to some level of, again, contract and clientery relation, whatever. All the world worked by different degrees in the same way, and the ability to power concentrate paradoxically would emerge from the same Western monarchies, surprise, surprise, in a moment, by the way, of crisis in the later Middle Ages. So the impression in general is that the narrative that we've been provided with, as if there was a general deficit in civilization in the West during the High Middle Ages, and so feudal monarchies were some kind of weird construction. First of all, like just looking around as we do on Schwerpunkt across the rest of Eurasia, they weren't strange at all. Not only that, they were incredibly statal in essence. In other words, they were much more power concentrated than most other powers out there. In this sense, also more functional and projected, in fact, towards also the later centuries' global expansion from the end of the Middle Ages and so on. Therefore, when you look at these topics in a manualistic sense, always pay attention to the way, not much they are framed, but the absence of a broader frame to actually see things in perspective about them. Now, the aforementioned seigneurial estates empowered their holders to act as the unifying force within the regions where they were situated, which, of course, every polity did. Indeed, after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, at least the internal loosening of a more concentrated power and the redistribution in terms of political, in fact, concentration on the basis of this seigneuries, indeed witness a recompositive process of essentially feudal nature. We should point out, because we will say it again and again, as I said also at the beginning already, in fact, that in all this, there always was a state, right? Feudal Europe, in this sense, was not an intricate forest of completely lacking any kind of public, universal, statal, monarchic force, nor there ever were, as some sort of, anti-system people that, mostly from a populistic direction, you want to see both in the left and in the right, tend to imagine a system where, especially the most successful, these apparently autonomous forces head towards actual authority, meaning everybody was fully aware that there was a state, a public domain, a central authority, a kingdom, an empire, and their success as lordships, as private powers eventually bestowed, or at least recognized, as it had always been the case with some parts of this, some forfeiting, some subcontracting of public power, which is perhaps the most important aspect of this relative political fragmentation, was the mean to these individuals' success. Right? It's always the story, no, we don't want the state, we don't want the tyrant. Then you realize that all the people who said that in history worked to create their own state, right? Their own tyranny, quote unquote, and actually to make civilization in the process. And so as soon as they came to be the actual kings, they immediately switched policy. They wanted to be the ones who extended that power further. I will not digress on certain other politological interpretations, but let's say I personally haven't seen in history any power that expanded without being the force of a civilization, all right, which also opens to a specific distinction. It is to say, political unity is the key here, as opposed to spiritual unity, right? At least politically speaking, we could say, for example, that the West appeared very fragmented. I still have people here thinking that the West was weak compared to the Byzantine Empire, that it was hopelessly fragmented, that they didn't know how to rule that. This is also the myth of the Dark Ages being reverberating. If you wonder why there are so many fans, so to say, unfortunately, of the Byzantine Empire, aside from Russian propaganda, there is this or self-dedication to some sort of Eastern spirituality that they don't know absolutely any ecclesiastical history of, by the way, nor the incredible autocratic brutality and unsuccessful and to which they were tied, compared especially to the West. The West had a veritable spiritual unity, was by far the biggest power in Eurasia, and it had the capacity not just to essentially overwhelm its neighbors, but to do so, in fact, under the guidance of different kingdoms, different realms. They are not, again, the fragmented little thing. They are, in fact, especially in the most successful case, fully fledged feudal monarchies that will achieve de facto almost universal power, even singularly speaking. We're talking the Holy Roman Empire that technically had to encompass the whole West and was in part recognized as such, and also by states that, of course, were quite jealous of their own autonomy from, say, a Germanic emperor. But think about the same France, think about Naples, think about states that today nobody even talks about and that were overwhelmingly rich and powerful, but nobody really even told you they existed in school, at university, and whatever, because also nobody really is interested in making this kind of statement of power. They mostly focus on culture, aesthetics, sort of essentially feministic, emotionalistic tendency, and eliminating that specific detail of actually shared, not just spiritual unity in this sense, but veritable political unity under the direction of universal authority. Right? The empire and the church were not some random players among others. They managed to coordinate. If we talk about the empire, also literally all lay power, recognizing itself within Western Christendom, cooperating with the emperor, with other monarchies to do things like, crusades, putting down heretics, and succeeding, by the way, in achieving, at least the literal explosion of Western power and actual superiority throughout most of the Middle Ages. I mean, the notion that, I made countless videos about this, that the West at some point was more backwards compared to the East, the Eastern Mediterranean. Really? At which point exactly? Like countries like, Italy or Gaul were ever less developed than, the Byzantine world that was very sort of fractal, even within its interland, and very much confined to a coastline. This is unfortunately what most people have been essentially deluded with for some sort of also anti-Western self-sabotage direction, and completely misunderstanding and or belittling or hating or depreciating these feudal monarchies, as we call them in simple terms, during the High Middle Ages, from the 10th, 11th to the 13th centuries. And I will keep, the Schwerpunkt is the right channel for understanding this perspective, right? If you came here, as many people do, just because I uploaded a video about a topic that is normally discussed online with that degree of superficiality, just know that I'm not here as a fanboy to tell you essentially, look, I made a video just for you because, you think that BS and so you should be into that. No, here I'm structuring a massively systematized, historically accurate and objectively balanced assessment of political, military, and social power throughout all the Middle Ages, and history based on the history of all the various regions, of all the various rulers, or various polities, and these institutions, right? Exactly to show you the superiority and inferiority of systems, right? And that is unescapable because at the time, in fact, we see the West also overwhelming the other polities. And so this is not a matter of, and all making it their own, westernizing them de facto, in very positive ways. I mean, those systems were able to embrace the Franco-Roman civilization. Look at most of the Slavs, for example, up to the Ruthenian Palatinate, from which still today a Greek Catholic church exists. If you don't know what it is, go check that out. Show like the best of our, essentially what it means to be a Westerner in a historically cultural sense, and in a deeper sense, a system of order that in fact was much better organized statally, even in this polystatality, so to say, than practically any other part in the world that we're aware of, especially if you look at this also in terms of actual evenemential stability. At some point, of course, you can look at China. It's a competitive system in this regard, but we've seen that the system was also much more socially sclerotic. The peasants were much more broken. Communal autonomy in China was much more reduced. The system was much more oligarchic and monocratic, without mentioning that there were times of great instability, and I don't know, the Mongols took over the system, whatever. The West had a different soul, a different spirit. Today we don't talk about that. I'm coming with new videos explaining this from probably from a metaphysical, religious, and traditional point of view. I made something, for example, there is the video about the Germanic Catholic miracle. If you're interested, that's an important video, and we'll build on that in the future as well. But we realize, especially that these Western monarchies were very powerful, very compact, and also able, fundamentally, to preserve most of what are the same national identities within a broader European space that shared, again, an enormous level of spiritual unity, by which today we recognize ourselves as European. And when we see, in fact, these characteristics, even within the same Europe, sort of degrading, especially towards the southeast to some degree, we can really appreciate what Western fundamentally means, right? And what is, in a sense, the length, the actual power that built up the systems. Not much some pre-orderly institutional form or category or structure, but the spirit that built the structure came to manifest in the way that we know. Now, at their outset, kings were predominantly major territorial lords, and their monarchical legitimacy was grounded in this identity, right? I will not digress on the migration era here. We're talking literally from the beginning of the period, say the 10th, 11th century. The reason why these states are called feudal monarchies is that, in fact, the monarchs were basically of the same princely scale of power of the other vassals, right? And were, in this sense, building up their state from within the broader one. The point being that the foundation of all these states, to a degree, was conventionally recognized, especially in the Romano-Germanic West, and so in the wake of essentially the post-Roman kingdoms that were in fact continuing, made really lots of videos on this, the same Roman statal philosophy in administrative, bureaucratic terms, etc., but being reinvigorated with some sort of more moral and warlike elements during the migrations, contemplated throughout all, in fact, also the Germanic laws that were issued in these countries, a public demand, a public authority, a central authority. A Clovis could theoretically claim that everything that existed within the Frankish kingdom was his own, right? This did not stem from merely legalistic or sort of administrative ambitions. That would follow suit in a broader sense, even though these lands fragmented in a privatistic oligarchic fashion to a degree before recompacting in different times for essentially new waves of moral force. Look at the Carolingian one, look at, again, also this one. You can argue the state was, as we explained in the video about Imperial Germanic miracle, a degree of sort of the makeup for lack of spiritual force of the populations. And this is true today if you look at it in a broader millenary perspective. However, literally, public demand was meant to belong to the sovereign because of his medium role with God. And so the fact that Imperium passed through he who managed to control all this extent. I mean, how were these kingdoms founded? Literally with the settlement of a people that these monarchs had control, had commanded. All right. So even if, of course, the Roman administration largely lived within these systems because it helped controlling them, and also the Germans were spiritually exhausted to a degree after the migration era, the system blended. It became a synthesis, and none of the two concepts were lost. Right, from one side, the monarch was really essentially a god on earth that derived power from the highest, right, and in this sense, parceling out pieces of the world based on his own level of divine connection. And at the same time, these systems were, in fact, given that he was not God with capital G, cope with that degree of human fall, and so basically cooperate with some state helping others achieve certain levels of stability. Think about the church practicing welfare, people, I don't know, not necessarily going to war altogether as during the migration era, but specializing in a rota system, society stratifying, etc. The powers of monarchs were rooted in and long retained in this patrimonial and seigneurial character, meaning that they exercised essentially an imperium on a certain amount of people that essentially inhabited a certain part of the land that they used to work and to provide surplus that was used in turn by the monarch to use this manpower and labor force to expand and consolidate further his power, and so therefore the one of the community. So monarchs were not fundamentally distinct from the practical authority wielded by other territorial lords, meaning that everyone who had a power of some sort deserved it to some degree, and by essentially recognizing a king's authority, de facto instantiated, right, or in the monarch from his side at the same time, the idea of the state, of this power, of the monarchy, and the public dimension this entail. As a result, the creation of cohesive power systems was not limited to those who held or attained royal status, but also included those who had secured comital or ducal titles of Carolingian origin or around their familial estates, for example. You can include everyone. Remember always that a government is the product of the decisive moral force of the people, meaning that even if you have, I don't know, a part of the people that is for this guy or the other against, essentially, as long as the guy is in charge, there is a decisive moral superiority of the group that backs him. They can be even represented, like especially in this era, by just a few people that, however, were very morally loaded. And again, an 11th century Miles was definitely someone who really was worth tens of other people, for that matter, that were necessary for him even to exist in terms of spending a lifetime of training, of war horse maintenance, the forage production, and all this stuff. And indeed, already in Carolingian times, as we've seen many times, comital, ducal, marginal powers, etc., were instituted to basically represent some extension of public authority. All right. So, in that video, for example, about the myth of feudalism and all the stuff that kings and generals were saying, when you look at the comital order, for example, this was historically stemming from already the Roman districtuation. It was stemming already from, even in the Barbaricum, like a certain group, a certain Volksgemeinschaft that had to survive in a part of the land that was occupied by the people, and in this sense collectively recognized also by a king and the rest of the inhabitants. A ducal title, a marginal title would have not existed hadn't there been a royal or an imperial authority. So it doesn't matter how, say, I don't know, the Duke of Normandy, because he had seized England as another kingdom, by the way, could be more powerful than his same lord, the king of the Western Franks, right? What matter is that within the Western Frankish system, of course, there was a hierarchical subordination of the vassals to the King of France, and that this was also just not an accident, right? When we make this paradox, for example, of the Ile-de-France essentially constituting just a principality among the others, Anjou, Burgundy, whatever, this was never like a place like the others, not by matter of subjective opinion, right? It wasn't, I don't know, a guy somewhere in Gaul said, well, this Western Frankish kingdom does not exist, essentially. It's just a historiographical construction, but there was a specific sacral foundation to the centrality of the king of the Western Franks that historically had installed itself into this seigneury, and that had been wielding power as much just as the Carolingians, the Merovingians had done, because they had been recognized as an authority. So the idea of the feudal pyramid that people mock, because they say, of course, this pyramid is not geometrically a pyramid. It's just a scheme that you make to kids in primary school to understand what this was about. It's still perfectly, functional, right? You can't use that as a meme, as a joke. There are people who still believe in that, because the hierarchical subordination literally worked like that, right? And of course, even if this looks more like a mountain with different peaks and different, valleys rather than a pyramid, it still corresponded to a metaphysical principle of superiority and inferiority that also, surprise, surprise, emerged into the actually fully fledged kingdoms. I mean, in this mess, how did it happen that the Ile-de-France came to be the center of the Western Frankish, and eventually the French state? Because it had already been founded as such since the beginning, right? And so historically speaking, even to deny this, or at least to attribute some accidental dynamic to the emergence eventually of that center is fundamentally ridiculous, right? It may have been that, for example, the Western Frankish kingdom, especially in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, was objectively the worst in terms of at least paper political, let's say, integrity, more than unity, because again, the kingdom always remained there. Nobody denied that it existed, even among all these vassals. Compared to, to the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the Italic one, the Burgundian one, it really seemed like the Western Frankish one was to collapse more easily. And that's eventually going to be the other way around completely, because it's going to be the most solid one at the end. And this in part stemmed from the fact that was the richest, where feudalism had already grafted itself well. So these princes, as sort of very rich, that they were in moment of crisis more difficult to control by a center, but they also constituted by themselves the glue that would recognize the obvious civilizational need to have a head, a power, a political compaction, which is also the one that sets the standards of what is an actual power, and therefore also in religious terms, the one blessed by God, that had also all a tradition within already the Frankish kingdom to begin with. So again, what happens in these centuries is not accidental. Surprise, surprise, the centers of kingdoms more or less remain always the same. You can argue that, Germany didn't really have a center, fair, because it was a kingdom sort of put together out of scratch of peoples that didn't even technically consider themselves like a nation, for example. It was less developed and whatever, but say, what is established at some point, right, in, Lombardy, in the Ile-de-France, in the Reconquista, with this axis essentially north-south of expansion, basically remains that, and it's not just like a roulette where you don't know what's coming next, right? Everything followed a sort of pretty obvious civilizational pattern, just like, the Saxon predominance in Britain, right? you had to see it coming. And so even though objectively the history of these countries is all like, oh wow, the system could collapse from a moment to another, still, first of all, it didn't, right? And why or how? Like, how likely is it to happen? Also, so frequently all across the board of Europe. And second, it did so from the already civilized basis, which is also the same reason why, I don't know, we said before, like, basically Southwestern Europe was more advanced, the post-Roman Europe, one in particular, and the West, right? Surely the Balkans weren't more developed because of the Byzantine Empire than especially Southwestern Europe. You can make an argument for Britain, but even there, like especially the English part, it's very debatable whether it was actually that backward, telling the truth. You can easily see the Scandinavian monarchies, Central European monarchies, Eastern European monarchies in particular, and the latter have, by the way, been largely evangelized by the Byzantines, took much longer to actually develop into something more stably unitary, right? And size does not matter, right? There are some powers that are just nominal in this degree, right? And specific centers are really something else, right? The power that France wields, for example, in terms of political concentration, including based on the measure of its internal enemies, is much bigger than, the one of Ruthenia, so to say, or Poland. Yet it's literally hegemonizing from a social-cultural point of view the entire West, including those countries so far away. So it's something enormous, unbelievable, and something especially studied even from a military point of view reveals things, honestly, my educational path had never heard, right? The fact that Eastern Europe imported Western weapons. Basically, the entire Western Eurasia imported Western weapons. And in that regard, like, eventually this era, even financially speaking, later Middle Ages, was the pivot around which most, in fact, Western Eurasia gravitated around. Is frankly a picture that either they tell you with low voice, but or they don't tell you at all, right? They focus maybe on the socio-economical aspect, but they don't show how comparatively successful the West actually was at this point in history. Now, what set kings apart from other lords, as we explained, was the formulation of this ideological and juridical concepts. They were not new, right? The concept of kingship was not new, right? It was atavic. It had started since the Indo-European migration. It was radically and traumatically as deeply ingrained into the fabric of European identity, right? There had never been a society without a sacred ruler, right? Greece, Rome, the Germans, they all share in their onomastics, in their mythology, in their institution, in their language. It's all, and make multiple videos on sacred royalty and traditional religion, it all gravitated around the most obvious concept of a leader, of a guide, right? Mostly, again, for this eminently military purposes, on the ideal that after the war ended, people could sort of enjoy their own liberty on the basis of their own individual value, right? And so having their own lordship to a degree, also lording over other people, the slaves, the whoever maintained their own power in virtue of their own, in fact, divine recognition as rulers. The traditional doctrine of the caestus was based exactly on this acceptance that the system was based in this way. In a sense, it still exists today. It's not like, for some reason, the Fourth Estate is continuously making a revolution. They don't. Most of them just stay there quietly and go about their own business, and that's how fundamentally things work to begin with. If anything, any rebellion stems from a shortcoming of authority, of the establishment of some sort. These concepts entail traditional duties such as safeguarding the vulnerable and the church, which is the way the man had to handle himself with a woman, upholding justice and preserving peace, or bringing order or chaos, And now they were properly, as concepts, further endowed with coercive rights and powers of direct intervention just by constitution, by legal custom, and the same royal laws, the laws of the people. This we made in the past years an entire series about medieval law, and we explained how this system basically worked. There were different types, say, of laws that were eventually superimposed, and then the theological, metaphysical principle from which they stemmed was also deeply connected with royal authority, and what was in fact divinely inspired as well. Again, I will not digress further on this, but there would be the certification of mostly a royal legislation now over a feudal practice and a national custom as well, that people sort of participated to different ways, because people had, remember, different worth, and so they were not really equal in front of anyone. Not even in front of God, as a matter of fact, if not in potential. Now, like prominent territorial lords, royal dynasties established to varying extent a hereditary principle ensuring the legitimate succession of both the estate, which formed the foundation of their power, and the title, which embodied unified authority. This was relatively new in the sense that a dynastic succession was not always warranted. The idea is that, again, power is power by those who essentially are able to wield it and have it in the moment, all right? This is why also great empires historically didn't really have a formalized succession system. Think about the Roman one, for example. Here, with the great effort, naturally, that had caused to cement some further seigneurial fief cohesion from this basis of this princely power, there was an increasing tendency from the side of the establishment, was essentially nobiliar in nature and so elite, to not just recognize one another across the board, across also multiple national boundaries, as a veritable, essentially, class of militares, especially, that would also gradually increase, stratified in the feudal hierarchy, but in fact, a sort of feudally established / achieved public establishment and authority. In other words, these chunks of, and it makes sense because these chunks, as we've seen, of principalities, duchies, etc., were already within a kingdom, already within an empire, and as such, they were recognized as, well, under us in the hierarchy, these are the most powerful elements. It's good to preserve them. It's good to maintain essentially a state based on this. Over time, both the estate and the royal title became detached from the individual who held them. As a consequence, that was also an important change in the. If you read Kantorowicz's "The King's Two Bodies," you will realize what that is. It's essentially the hypostatization of an idea of state that transcends the various rulers who come to wield it. Essentially, it's still based on a personal authority. Essentially, the king, the crown. Hence, the king's two bodies. It's like la bannière ne meurt jamais, or after a king dies, basically long live the king. Again, that is actually also a bit of a modernization of the traditional concept of royalty, but it's still enshrined the sacrality of the institution that was, in this sense, upheld throughout all the Ancien regime. The crown, as the ultimate symbol of royalty, came to represent also this more abstract notion encompassing the entirety of estates, rights, and privileges of royal authority that had historically wielded them and or at least conferred further power through their own, as we've seen, divine medium function, aligning its meaning with that of the res publica, personified by the monarch that, remember, in theory controlled. This is since Clovis, right? The kingdom, the empire, as a large public domain. Naturally, during the High Middle Ages, the feudalization and privatization of the system had reached peaks whereby, I don't know, there are things like the allodia that are de facto inalienable core possessions stemming from banal lordship. And so basically, a level of power that had been recognized by the general moral superiority of the system, so including the king and everyone, as just pertaining to the core of that house, the local clan that ruled however it had developed itself, right? It's what we were saying before regarding the fact that you shouldn't even care about leaving this margin of private liberty, because at the end of the day, if you're successful as a ruler, those people will follow themselves with their private means. And this is something that the Franks historically had already established after the migration era, when the late Roman state had instead habituated, a bit like today, people to think that there was a state in which they sort of depended rather than being the active participants of the same. This is also a bit pushed for the actual late antique state, that in any case did not last too long. It wasn't even this immense thing. Just remember that the Roman Empire was founded without that and with that traditional principle stemming from the same Indo-European. So in fact, in the Romano-Germanic world was simply overlapping in juridical, cultural terms, right? Concurrently, in the High Middle Ages, terms like fiscus and demanium, right? So the fisc, the domain, emerged to designate the public estate as it pertained to the holder of public authority. And essentially in these kingdoms, given that, as we explained, there were major allodial possessions, then there were the beneficia, etc. In theory, again, by hierarchical order, all of this could belong to the king. But de facto, there was, in practical terms, some specific land was understood as public domain. Right, these were major estates. We've seen this in many videos, including the one about royal abbeys, for example. In that case, had, in theory, an ecclesiastical immunity, but were still seen as privately owned by the house to some degree. That's also complicated. Let's not throw the church into it, because at least we made many medieval Christianity videos. And the church was overwhelmingly important in this system, to say the least. Probably in terms of state building institutions. It was actually part of the reason why these institutions could successfully develop in the first place, at least one of the major ones. But there were literally like some pieces of land, like also forests, think about royal forests, also strategic territories that were historically left belonging to the king in that sense. So to say, it's a bit like, the imperial provinces in Rome as opposed to the senatorial one. We like to think of Rome again as a modern secular state. This was exactly the same thing, all right? There is a level of public land that is used for organizing things also a bit in a bigger fashion. We've seen it also in the communes. There are the private houses, so to say, and that there are public spaces, the squares, and certain areas for public market, for, the same walls. There is a level of centralization, especially as far as military emergential situations are concerned, that has to be functional to cope with a crisis and drawing the necessary resources to drive the entire system altogether. The king was in that sense, for example, we've seen it in the videos about the army's organization and the way, these forces were put together, recruitment, etc. The king at large was gradually advocating, this is a term you hear especially for modern law, right? But the idea is that you basically allow the king to receive your money. Basically, you accept to pay taxes in exchange for the king not to billet his troops. There are originally also private troops of his in your own land, in your own territory, so that you basically grow a bit less demilitarized, but you have at least a more functional military that you can also participate into to be co-opted to higher offices, etc. This is also what happens also throughout the modern age. That's how states actually developed historically in modern sense, if we like to use the term modern. And so you understand it started since the Middle Ages. We've seen it also in the videos about the foundation of core permanent armies that are de facto public, say at least royal power is the one that starts that the earliest, with also relatively private means through this domain, right? That is de facto the king's private possession, right? It is normally larger and so on. You can debate what is permanent, what does that mean? It had always been a level of permanence, right? Or at least semi-permanence in military organization. So even in the war bands of the migration era, or the Indo-European invasions, I'm not going to digress on this. However, here, the levels of scalar organization, training, general supply, etc., are much bigger. And so they make armies also much more effective. And that's why you have these monarchies profiling themselves as massive political territorial realities at a regional scale, right? And the capacity of reaching pretty far away. Now, among the strategies employed in this consolidation, the assertion of the sacred character of monarchy was particularly significant because it had always been there. And now it took the very specific formalized rules, characters that before were just to be given for granted, right? Beyond the capacity to build and sustain personal connections with great lords and other subjects, the preeminence of kings also stemmed from attributes that positioned the sovereign within a divine relationship, primarily expressed through the symbolism of the coronation ceremony. But it was all one with it, right? As moderns, we tend to split the two things. But again, if you hadn't had that power, if you had not been recognized as a king, you would have not been capable of controlling these people and even having them accept your sacrality, right? It's not like a random guy walked into a church just because somebody said that was a king, and so there was an entire power structure behind that. It was constantly active and operating to affirm that kind of kingship. And there are some polities that are destroyed in the process during the Middle Ages, like the smaller ones, the ones that mostly also the local, for example, principalities gradually are absorbed, mostly co-opted, not quite simply eradicated. Again, it was important to maintain certain specific ducal, princely titles, but we're often seeing it in the historical regional series, right, where you have these local lords building a princely power, then competing with others, ending up subjugated, and then the crown takes over this territory, and often considers like an appanage for the royal members, etc. So this process was restoring, of course, the same concept of public institution per se, or at least it just was the manifestation of such restoration. And at the same time, it historically forged, because we are in the Middle Ages that are not antiquity or not modern age, new political frameworks, characteristic political frameworks, not entirely new, this is wrong, rooted in a conception, in fact a very old conception of monarchic power that continued also markedly from that of the so-called Romano-Germanic kingdoms and of the Carolingian Empire. Some historians say, basically before kings did not really have that much power, it was just a new thing that feudal systems had, based themselves. They say essentially the earlier systems based themselves on personal bonds between the king and his people, between the king and the prominent lords of his realm. And that in this sense there would have been not some organizing principle for societies increasingly defined in territorial terms relative to the spaces they inhabited. This doesn't make much sense. I mean, it is true that, of course, the territorialization of power and the control of the monarchy on it was much higher and bigger, but not in the sense that the traditional foundations for this to happen were different from the previous system. Right? This is very important to stress. Shared characteristics of monarchical development during the High Middle Ages included the widespread acknowledgement by most lords and local communities of the king's superior authority, and the formal relinquishment to the crown of a significant share of the jurisdictions they held over their territorial domains. Consequently, while diverse jurisdictions over lands and people persisted, all were at least theoretically subordinate to the king's supreme authority, which again was already the case in the past, right? The king, in the moment in which territorialization happened in a more unitarily expandable way, entailed the capacity of the king to intervene directly in the various communities that also provided with the systems that we've seen, for example, for the Romano-Germanic kingdoms to continue their public functions, their territorial control, etc. The distortion a little bit in perspective is the fact that, again, the early Middle Ages had been particularly difficult, scarce and surplus for everybody across the world. And so it seems as if, ideally, like, kings were not meant to control the system in a broader sense, but it was just mostly a temporary lack of actual power. Now, the establishment of such monarchical systems in the High Middle Ages did not eradicate, not could it have eradicated the multiplicity of entities entitled to particularism. On the contrary, especially in the Western world, and this is quite unique instead, this particularism thrived, right? You don't witness, an expansion of feudalism, and in this sense, like a collapse of the communal civilization. Right, there were some areas that were perhaps better or worse predisposed for that, but in practice, you realize that great part of the power of this kingdom stemmed from the quite thriving forces that the monarchies were able to keep under, to co-opt. It's not like there was an internal struggle, but that's actually an indication of quite strong, robust health. People exchange it for unsuccessful politics, right? Just saying, okay, since there is only one guy who rules over everybody, that means that the system works well. No, right? That's like what happened to the Byzantine Empire. Was overrun by the Westerners who ruled that way, and not as a band of barbarians, a horde of invaders, but actually pretty disciplined, functional, professional, well-organized forces, right, stemming even from individual chunks of the whole West, right? And so that, I think, speaks volumes about what we just said about also spiritual unity and the value of civilization at large. Always remember that, again, the West entailed, by the way, the presence of a universal authority that was much, in the sense, more far-ranging than the Byzantine one. Even just geographically. The same goes for Islam. That was all fractal. The West, and it was not just fractal, but had different heads calling themselves caliphs. In the West, you didn't have different emperors calling like that. You had the acceptation of a specific hierarchy, both in lay and spiritual terms, that kept the system spiritually unitary and incredibly healthy and successful. The high medieval royal dynasties did not seek simplification, but instead aimed to coordinate, safeguard, and protect, increasingly employing a versatile mechanism like the vassal relationship that was just an implementation of the previous clientary relations. This enabled the monarchy to engage with the complexity of established or emerging powers. The vassal relationship was reinterpreted and reshaped, or at least provided with greater stability, better definition, including through legal reflection in ways that favored the vassal, with their obligations becoming more clearly defined and restricted. This is what Kings and Generals was trying to say by essentially acceding by saying, no, there wasn't actually even a system you can call feudalism, because somebody wrote that, oh, look, across Europe they use different terms as opposed to what feudal, so the vassalic beneficiary system was, or how it's still the same clientele. I mean, society is very homogeneous in many ways across most of these Western lands, and with different aims, it worked basically in the same way. And even when it had, again, all this kind of diversity. You have to look at the fact that it was dominated by a higher universal direction, right, and a royal one as well, etc. So nothing was divergent from the world system. In fact, these systems in turn were de facto other universitates, as they were called in Latin. So essentially, as the term says, that what do you mean universal? It means turned versus towards a unitary point, right? Hence the most traditional understanding of the truth, of reality, of the world, universum, right? They were all part of a single body. There was a mystical as much as also as an earthly one. We witness a relative change from the strictness of homage to a single lord and the elimination of the original precariousness of the grant. When we look at feudalism, everything becomes better defined from the later 12th century. We know it very well all across Europe. Again, for example, kings and generals was claiming that literally feudalism was born at this point, invented by the Italian jurists to sort of solve more the, some alleged problem that, as nobody would have allegedly ever explicitated how the system had to work. If anything, the system became ever complex and required better legalization, but this does not mean that it did not exist before. Here, a terminology is employed to define very well specific juridical institutions that already existed, that now were ever better disciplined. All right, but the concept was there, and of course, feudalism in this sense did exist. Then we can use, again, another term, feudalism, as like Byzantine. You can use it just for the sake of convention, but this is what we intend as a whole. What the heritability of the benefits was enhanced. Think about the Edictum de Beneficis from the 11th century, rather, and from Conrad II, the Salian Holy Roman Emperor. In any case, with these attributes, it became one. Let's say this feudal system became one of the most effective instruments for defining the relationship between the monarch and the great lords of the realm. So it's this later medieval feudalism that we know better, that sort of also formalized better at some point in the Ancien regime, also sclerotized, while some other form of state wielded by the same monarch was kind of emerging as well through further avocation, power concentration, and so on. But it did exist, it was functional, and it had its own historical relevance and meaning from quite an old background. Another pivotal factor in the formation of new political systems at this point was the development of fiscal and juridical control mechanisms rooted in both basic systems of household offices responsible for managing the estates of kings and princes, and in systems capable of exercising territorial control on behalf of the sovereign across an area as vast as the kingdom itself. This was already there. Again, the king had always settled some essentially garrisons, some clans, some we've seen it, for example, recently in the video about the Longobard kingdom, right? That was established as such, and there was a hierarchy of subjects, of leaders, and so on. And that, of course, in higher medieval times acquired a greater robustness, a better sort of institutional, juridical identification, definition. The increase in the number and specialization of royal agents, the functional specialization of the offices they oversaw, the parallel, gradual specialization of the royal entourage into true governmental departments, as well as the rise of conciliar governance forms, are, if anything, the newer characters, more by form than by substance, and there is still an overarching form within which they sort of fit historically. For example, also the rise of conciliar governance that had always been there, right? The king had never even claiming full, as we've seen, public authority controlled everything without the consensus of the people, because again, he needed really the decisive moral force of the same. And so we easily see, like, all these features we listed in the histories of both earlier consolidated kingdoms, such as England or the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, and those that reach stabilization through more protracted processes, such as France or the Iberian monarchies, regardless of how even powerful at some point they were, because they followed essentially very similar patterns. These were all Latin Germanic systems, and they pretty much also stemmed from the Franco-Roman influence all along. I mean, as we said before, the Western Frankish kingdom took more time to be fully politically compacted in terms of direct monarchic control, but let's say the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, the Norman Kingdom of England, they all stem from the Western Frankish mold. So the Iberian monarchies were influenced by the neighboring France. The same goes for Germany. And again, each of these monarchies, as you know, will function in a different, peculiar way. But the mold and the general principles laying under that, also in a metaphysical and political, cultural sense, were practically the same. It was only between the late 12th and the mid-13th centuries that transformations in monarchical institutions gained more explicitly clear trajectory, enabling them to function effectively within the entire countering territory of the individual political entities. And this, of course, witnessed a big deal of social-cultural support that stemmed from the necessity, again, of stabilizing the system. Nonetheless, the origins of these developments trace back to very early on, so serving both as the catalyst and the original cause. The 11th century is quite important. I mean, you could find all the layers in between. The 11th century is a moment of further stabilization. There is a trade balance shifting fully in favor of the West, especially in the Mediterranean and probably the continental system expands dramatically. It starts again to create this massive axis, especially running along the patterns of the former western half of the Roman Empire, and institutions start to more fully concentrate, more sort of civilly, orderly, and driven and powerful contexts, communities, regions to connect. This is the age of the Crusades. This is the age of the papal monarchy. It's a moment of, in fact, very strong definition of the respective spheres of influence in Europe through these institutions. Like in the kingdoms, also sort of more or less stabilized in areas also that they hadn't historically occurred. Think about, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia. These were relatively new countries that are fully identified as principalities on their own, later all kingdoms becoming. So this is also a major expansion from the within, right? The 11th century to the 13th centuries marked thus a period, in fact, of remarkable expansion, not just economic and demographic, but also military and institutional in the history of medieval Europe. We've made so many videos on Schwerpunkt about this that there is no doubt about how to profile that. Again, often we don't, probably we give this for granted, right? At least our educational system does not insist too much for how it prospectively relevant appears also in the general context of the era. So not the only thing that existed, and so pointing out the limits and just looking at our contemporary states, but looking at how or what and why these systems were succeeding at the time, also in the world compared to others, and how aggressive and loaded they were, by the way. The profound transformation of seigneurial politics and also a rural society, for example, which reshaped the countryside under the guidance of the vassalic elite, provided much of the also concrete foundation for dynastic powers. The local communities were cooperative with the leaders that managed to bring further order and stabilizing situation further. And also greatly internationalizing. There is all a history of errant knighthood that represents this. So in this context, the rise of new communal entities based on the urban centers played, as we know, a central role in advancing the initiatives of royal dynasties. Additionally, the ideological and institutional changes in the church following the Gregorian era, as we were saying, lent significant momentum for the formation of political orders. This was also the cradle of the aforementioned institutional juridical acquisitions that stemmed from the recovery of Roman law, but in function of the now in force laws as well, to which they were integrated only where a gap was found, and to also reinforce the theoretical, the philosophical information of new theory, new say strengthening ideology. The papacy championed and supported the establishment of superior temporal authorities capable of ensuring its autonomy, which, if you think about that, goes very much against the narrative that for some reason the church was somehow a problem in this landscape, and that also simply opposed the empire without any specific explanation. There is a crisis of universal authorities. Later in the 14th century, also recently made a video about Ludwig the Bavarian. This, as you know, marks a very specific ideological watershed in the history of, at that point, more increasingly nationalistic monarchies rather than else. Even though the universal plan was at least always upheld, even by those powers seeking this further regionalization. We made lots of videos about the spin-off, that the output properly, that the investiture controversy also represented. The clash between the papacy and the empire wasn't a critical process of disintegration. It was actually a massive process of compaction and further integration to define exactly, in fact, the prerogatives of the two authorities in the moment, in fact, in which the whole West was ever more confederated and cooperative in all its parts. There is also, of course, in fact, together with the autonomization of different kingdoms, the establishment of new ones, this great process also further Roman evangelization, liberating the church from the aggressive control of seigneurial powers, namely kings and princes able to maintain peace and equilibrium among interconnected and competing political and patrimonial systems, with a church who was actually backing their further development from the within. And that, in fact, is a policy that not just the church pursued from Rome, that had successfully hegemonized the spiritual temper of Europe from quite a while, by the way, and always on the basis of the Holy Urbs, since in full continuity with Romanity, hence also a Holy Roman Empire, in many ways literally the same Roman Empire. And in these guys' mindset, not just the Holy Roman Emperors, but everybody involved being the thing, but showing that kings and emperors themselves, in their more sort of regional, national dimension, made extensive use of the church to consolidate their power compaction on the land. We've seen it really for every country. All right. Finally, it's worth emphasizing that the consolidation of monarchical powers at this point in history coincided with an unparalleled intensity and originality in legal studies, driven primarily by the remarkable exegetical work that we're recalling before on Roman law, essentially Justinian's, that is to say, basically Theodosius's Corpus Juris Civilis. Justinian fundamentally expanded that the bulk was the Theodosian one, on the basis, by the way, of a previous Roman law that also in the empire was not that sort of perpetua sanctio that the Byzantine emperors had also transformed it into. So there were many, and also the Byzantine Empire was a pretty traditional system in its legal understanding of sebastocratic power. It was sort of more sclerotic because it was more authoritarian, because the system allowed for it to remain like that and to further survive in the medieval millennium as that, at least, Western blows aside. But that's exactly the point. I mean, the fact that the Roman law was injected further to reflect again on the prerogatives of universal authorities, filling the gaps in the juridical systems existing at the time. Also because society was ramping up dramatically in terms of complexity, of certification, of regulation. There were lots of traffics, unprecedented wealth, the highest per capita wealth concentration laid in Europe historically. And as we've seen, there are communes thriving that are still part of the various kingdoms. They still consider themselves as subjects to the Holy Roman Emperors, even when they pick arms against them as free citizens in arms, right? And that concept of freedom particularly was upheld in a Romano-Germanic sense more, exactly among those communities that had historically been, in fact, more literate, more juridically oriented, more civilized, more organized. So we put Rome, the Italian communes in that, but all this helped dramatically, saying feudal monarchies to consolidate in ever more orderly fashion and successful, in fact, hegemonizing the entire Europe to great extent. I mean, essentially the Italian communes in central and northern Italy escaping that, but in that sense developing, as we've seen in our military historical videos, powers that really reached the same largest ones. In the West, it was the French one, even surpassing it to some extent. So it's something which it's so incredible in its expansion that I can't but reiterate how seemingly oblivious we are in front of this when we study medieval history and we compare Western civilization with the rest, especially also with its immediate neighbors. All right. Now, references to Roman legal sources which articulated the concepts of authority and public power with clarity and nuance by extremely competent people that, remember, studied all this by heart, were essentially even knighted for the level of expertise they achieved, which is literally, they were considered containing imperium, so a level of sacredness because of their wisdom, provided the essential theoretical framework for consolidating seigneurial and feudal prerogatives in the hands of monarchs, thereby serving as instruments of their ascendancy. In fact, these individuals were incredibly prized, and this is the moment in which universities start emerging, again, in places that, as we've seen, were also politically, military active, but not a feudal anarchy or chaos. On the contrary, places that were so stable, rich, and provided a surplus that could dedicate this large amount of also of intellectual resources to their state building, to their need of justice, of regulation, and spreading, in fact, Roman law by the later Middle Ages across all of Europe, once again, as de facto common law. We've seen this in many videos, also during the Renaissance, etc. So it's incredibly fascinating because, as a circle, it makes sense in the reinvigoration, probably a great part of what and that continued later on. I mean, civil law, as opposed to also to common one, is basically just a continuation of that. And common law is another philosophy. It's not really, again, so distant when we, again, measure it in spiritual and cultural terms in proximity with, in fact, civil law within the West, right? And otherwise, like, we would have not had that important level of homogeneity in development. To a degree, England also relatively lagged behind in later Middle Ages to other countries in that institutional development. France, for example, had a much sort of bigger and stratified state, etc. But it's not a bad thing. It's not. It fits the general level of Western cohesiveness, regardless, and the division was yet to come in a sense, because common law was basically there. And again, also in civil law, de facto, some foundational institutions are the same ones that we acknowledge in again, also in that ancestral Roman fashion, as much as being found among the peoples of the Barbaricum that during the migration era took over Western Europe. So, and were heavily Romanized and perpetuated that, as we've seen, political and style tradition. So again, I think this is remarkably important. I don't know how helpful you consider these intros and, let's say, this approaches to medieval politics and institutions. Of course, it's always a pleasure to sort of space alongside these this topics of what they provide in their historical narrative and general picture. What is fascinating is, of course, the fact that there is a general interconnection across the say, properly Western civilization that is already present since antiquity, and that reinvigorates itself in this political institutional fashion due to the changes, let's say, of mankind, of the world, and that here are expressed in a particularly European way, in the most successful one, for sure in Western Eurasia. I haven't created a playlist about medieval law. I can't do that somehow, but there's one, for example, about administration, if I'm not wrong, that of government, yes, that I will insert this video in that. That is, again, the most obvious, let's say, section for your consumption that you can appreciate if you're curious about the rest. Again, this stuff comes always from the so-called cycle, so it's somehow more sobering in terms of specifics, but it's also necessary because having a comprehensive vision of the whole is as important as knowing the details and giving a form and general meaning to the whole, right? So really here, pretty big playlist, I think 120 videos that can beautifully render all together the soundness of this institutional development. This is the stata force. This is what perhaps one of the greatest prejudices still that the Middle Ages suffer of. It really is, and it should be torn down because of the inconsistency of the same. The fact that the states were weak, that the Middle Ages were about the general instability and fragility. No, if you especially look at it in a broader historical trajectory, you realize that everything was pretty well successful. There was a pretty sound civilization throughout this time, based on previous civilization, safeguarding the system, also throughout the various challenges that occurred to the West ever since, and that we're still looking at, essentially. So, again, I think very important, very relevant in many historically meaningful ways. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.